Now, before we learn, in school, it's funny. I got a really great lesson from my daughter's kindergarten teacher, and on art and storyboarding and everything. It was a great lesson, and it was just this. She said, "We don't teach kids in kindergarten. We don't teach them to read and write. We prepare them to read and write. And first, in order to read and write, we need to teach them how to recognize patterns. So this is something that they might have on their walls. And if you have kids, or if you remember when you were in school, you might have remembered something like this on the wall, where you see patterns of a circle, circle, square, circle, circle, what? And these kinds of little flashcard tools helped kids learn to look for patterns. The other thing was set of values. To do mathematics, you need to have some ordering and setting of values. So they might connect a symbol like a 3, and then the left arrow saying that is less than a 7. And so you start to get values. This is greater than this. This is less than that. And so you can associate a symbol with a value. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about math and the language of math versus the language of art, we don't have predetermined values. Okay? If I say I've got 2 circles and one's more important than the other, I have to tell you why it's going to be more important. Is it bigger than the other? Is it smaller than the other? Is it more contrast? Is it brighter? I have to give you information. So 2 circles, I could have a big one and a small one, and I can make the small one seem more important, or I can make the big one seem more important. Okay? So we don't have inherent values to any of the components. We create them in our compositions, and that's where composition really helps out. So what I want you to do is just pull out a piece of paper, and this is basically your figure-ground relationship. Okay? I want you to put a circle right in the middle of the square. Now your square is, you can do it small on your paper because we're going to do 9 more of them. Okay, so if we take a look at the circle in the square, I'll do it up here with you. And I'm going to say, try to get that the best I can in the middle there. What's the, let me put it this way. This is the figure ground. So this is our figure ground relationship. We've got an object on this ground. We've defined the border, so we've defined the ground, and within that, we have this shape, okay? So that being the case, any of our images, anything we compose, is going to be based on this figure ground relationship. That's our basic kind of a thing. But once we've drawn this, we realize, what's this emotionally express? What is this, what we've drawn with a circle right in the middle of this square? What kind of emotion does this express? None. It's static. This is static. Okay? It doesn't have an expression. So here's what I want you guys to do next, is we'll draw 8 squares like you see up there. Okay? We'll draw 8 squares. And within each of those squares, I want you to put a circle. And these circles, just one circle in one square. That's it, just one circle. And I don't want you to use any lighting, any shading. It's just a line, just a circle. But the important thing is that I want you to do is I want you to place the circle. Now you can change its size and its position. And just by size and position alone, you can create these 8 different, or express these 8 different feelings, whether it's light. So go ahead and do that, and put the circles in these squares to reflect the idea here. So go ahead and give it your best shot, and think about, how would you put a circle and in a square, and how big would it be, and where would you place it if you want to make it feel like it's light, okay? Or if it feels heavy, or if it feels like it's rising up or falling down, okay? You can crop the circle. It can fill the frame in any of these that you want, or it can go in or out of the frame. But clearly a circle in a square. And as you're doing this, it's really kind of clear. It's interesting. I look at it and I think it's interesting from the standpoint that, one of these common rules that you usually hear is don't put anything right in the middle of the frame. Anybody ever tell you why? It's static. Okay. So a lot of times people will look at something and say, well, that's not expressive, or it's frozen. Well, you're right. It's frozen. It's stuck right in the middle. But is that a bad thing? I raise that question. Is it a bad thing? If I'm going to do a picture of something that's immovable, that's stable, and I want to convey that idea, maybe I will put it right in the middle. And, firmly taking that middle position, because that's what I want to express. If that's what I'm trying to express, I may lean on that and actually do it. Tangents, avoiding tangents is a whole other thing. Maybe tangents have an effect. They have a visual effect. If you're trying to achieve a certain feeling in your image, you may employ tangents. The side effect of tangents is it does flatten your image. And a lot of people that are trying to gain a lot of visual depth in their image, they want to avoid that flatness. So that's what they bump up against. But there is a place for it. There are times you might use it. I just kind of look at it and say, well, this is one of those things. And something that appears light might be somewhere at the top of the frame. Okay? If it's light, it might appear at the top of the frame. Now, it could be just inside the top, because something light and something rising just might even be cropped, right? Because this feels like it's rising more than this one over here, doesn't it? Okay? It has that feeling because it's starting to float out of the frame. Okay? So, or rising up might help define it. Falling down. Falling down, again, this might be something where you're going out of the frame. You're falling out of the frame. So you're using your figure and ground relationship to say something about it. You have a point of view about that. Something heavy, that might be, you might think of it in a couple different ways too. It might be the volumetric mass might make it feel heavy if it's big. And at the same time, if it's sitting on the ground, it won't be floating. It might be big and sitting right here on the ground. So heavy might be somewhere in here. Now you might have a little variation on that. Heavy might be, or big, let me make the difference with big. Big might even just be something like this where it's, completely going outside of the frame and cropped. So big and heavy have some similarities there in scale, but heavy you might have just sitting right on the border, using the border, as a device too. Small, as opposed to the big. Small would be a small circle. Of course, you might do a small circle, but it's this small. It might be close. Close meaning lower to the bottom of the frame. Now, the reason that I might not make it up in the top of the frame is this. If I made it up here, if I put it up here, before there was perspective, and not that we all know this or go about doing it, there's a simple way of going about this. But before we had perspective, in different areas around the world, they would depict things higher in the frame if they were farther away. And they would depict things lower in the frame if they were close. And it's a real simple, practical reason why they did that. And different cultures did it at different times. It happened all over. It happened in Chinese scrolls, in Persian miniatures. It happened in a lot of different places around the world. They would do that. And the reason is, it's pretty simple. If we don't use perspective, but if you just put one hand up and one hand down like this, think of it as your cone of vision. If you reach out your arms, if you're standing here like this, sideways, okay, and this is your cone of vision. And so I put one arm up this way and one arm down this way, right? And I just walk towards something. What's going to happen is anything that gets close to me is going to touch this first. This won't touch anything. So as we move through the world, just from our our cone of vision, things will enter, or the closest things to us will be coming from the bottom of that cone of vision. So you don't need a scientist, you don't need a historian. You just need to observe and walk around and be perceptive to your cone of vision, and you can draw this way. Okay? So anything that you bump into, and you can do it at home, do it later, just put your arms out and, expressing that cone, and walk towards something, and you see it's going to hit towards the bottom. Or the bottom of whatever it is, if it's a banner or something like that, the bottom will drop out of the frame first. Okay? So it will come at you faster. So towards the bottom, if it's something small and towards the bottom, being towards the bottom, you're going to tell the viewer it's near. Up here, you can say it's far. So if it's near and it's small relative to this, then you're going to say, okay, it's a small object. This could be the sun. It could be something massive, but it's just far away. So that might be the difference with those. Okay? So something moving. Now we can go towards any edge of the frame, right? I'm just moving over here towards this side. Now what happens when I put something off-center, not static, but I crowd it towards one side? What's happening is we're gaining visual tension right along this edge. Mine is up high. I got a little bit here and a little bit here. So this is what I call visual tension. What happens is our eyes scan things, and our eyes scan things rapidly like this, okay? And when you have an area of visual tension, our eyes scan, but they move faster along these little areas down through here. We might scan across here like this, but when it gets here, it goes really fast. So our eyes scan and identify this area where there's tension, and that's what hits our nervous system, okay? Because we have this tension in here. Kazimir Malevich did a drawing. He drew a circle on a square, and he put it towards one corner, right? And then what he did is he drew it again, and he turned the frames. And you get a different impression of what that circle is, a different emotion from that circle, okay? And this is exactly what we're doing. We're looking at starting with a simple figure-ground relationship and saying, what do I want to say with that circle? What is important? So we learned two things here: size and placement. Okay? Size and placement matter. So in your composition, the size of objects and where you place them, they matter a lot. Okay? It will help you, like you see in these 8 figures here, it'll help you create an expression. Okay? And I know this sounds really simple, and we're just doing this simple little model of a circle and a square, but if you take it to heart with any of your compositions, you say, well, if I'm doing a landscape and I want to say it's a big tree and it feels like it just rises up into the sky, well, I'm going to push it up into the top, maybe crop it up into the top of the frame. Or maybe something seems really big and something small compared to it. I'm going to create these relationships, okay? And all of these, like I was mentioning with the small here, they have multiple factors. There's not just one factor to these. So we can't really say this is absolutely rising and this is absolutely heavy. It's big and it rests on the bottom of the frame. Combining a few of these ideas gives us that response. We can't say it automatically is that, but we can say that by making a small circle here, this could appear as a large circle in the distance. This has more of the sensation because it's size and placement. So there's multiple factors, but just keep in mind that your size and placement are really critical in your composition. Okay? Now, since we're dealing with just a circle and a square, I'm going to go. I can put this. I'll draw these, and you guys can draw these too. Just kind of walk through with me, because I think it's important when you draw it yourself, you make it your own. Okay, so if we're just looking at a circle and a square in our spatial effects, we might say this, a circle and a same size square, if you're having two of these things, okay? We might look at these two things. I think of a really good example. Let me put this over here a little bit. Similar in size. I'll reduce this down just a little. Even though these two things are different size, they're similar volume, similar mass, right? And when we look at these two like this, we tend to compare them. We compare this to this. So we end up, our responses is making a comparison. Okay, so we make a comparison there. If I do this circle, and I put it really close to the square, I've created visual tension, right? Just like before, I've created visual tension. But now I want to look at the relationship. Okay? So I'm thinking, when I do this, all of a sudden my response is, there's something between these two. There is a connection of some kind. Here, we're just comparing one to the other. Okay, one's a circle, one's a square. Here, I'm going to start looking at what's the relationship between the circle and the square. Rather than two distinct different things, I'm going to be looking at the relationship of those. So when they come closer together, we start to kind of in our mind put them together. Okay? Then if I touch them or bring them together, you see how this looks a little flatter than this one. Still a little bit, just so we see a little difference. And you can see the difference between this. This gets very flat. So that's a response you get when you have a tangent. The image all of a sudden goes very flat. And then we have some spatial options again, where you have a circle overlapping the square. Okay? Or we can have the square overlapping the circle. So overlap is going to give you some spatial effect. Do you see that? Out of all of these little diagrams, the two on the far right, there's more of the feeling of a spatial effect between these two than there is with the others. This one is the flattest. The one with the tangent is flattest. But again, this one we want to compare this to that. Now we're exploring the relationship between the two. It becomes more important. Here, our image is flattened out, and these two showed a little bit more spatial depth. Again, it's like simple little diagrams. Now, if we change the size, we want to change the size. We have a small circle and a bigger square. We can add to that. We get the same thing. Now that in this situation, the square is dominant. So now we've said, here we want to compare these two. And so it's shape that we're looking at. Here, we clearly establish a dominance. Okay? So we've established a dominance there. Just by size, we've made that dominant. Again, I'm creating tension. If I go close, my tangent goes flat. Okay. Same thing. Okay, so it goes flat. Then I get a spatial difference if I'm going to do the same thing, and I put this small circle overlapping the square. And then what I'm going to do is I'll do the square and the circle behind the square. So out of these two on the far right, which one appears to be deeper space? Meaning you have a circle and a square. Which one appears like, the one on the left, does this one appear like the circle and the square are closer together than this square and this circle? Or the other way around? The relationship between the circle and the square is, it feels closer. It feels like they're closer in space, like this. Whereas the one on the right, where the square and the circle feels farther back there. Okay? That's because of the scale. Because you have a smaller object in front of a bigger object, it feels close. And the far right, this is shallow space, and this is deeper space. Okay? So it gives the appearance, just because of your scale and what's overlapping, if something big is overlapping something small, you get a little bit greater sensation of space. Now, regardless of what you're drawing, painting, or whatever, one of the things that you can do, and one of the things I'd like you to do too, is gather a few images during the week, pick up some pictures or whatever. You can look at paintings, you can look at photographs, you look at anything, and then just start to assess what's going on in some of these things. Start to break it down. Look for a couple of these things. How does something look like it's deeper space? And if you flipped it, would it be different? Because these are the little things that will help you enhance your recognition of space. They'll give you an emotional direction. They'll help you express yourself in your composition more. But you have to start looking for these things. They're there. They're all out there. And you just have to start. Once you start looking at them and identifying, you're going to see them more and more and more often. And when we identify them in our own work, we can see where it's working, what's not working. Maybe I wanted to create a situation with deeper space and I did this. Well, then I know if I flip it, maybe I'd get more what I'm looking for. So we can also take a look at this is a size dominance, right? So, but if we're dealing with the same size, I've got a circle and a square that are the same size, right? Okay, so I can make the circle dominant. It's a little bit higher and it overlaps the square. I can do the circle and the square this way. And this way makes the circle subordinate. I can make it more subordinate by putting it below and behind. If it's a little higher, it feels more dominant. These are two equal size objects. The one that's higher feels a bit more dominant. And then when you have them overlapping, higher and lower, you're compounding the effect. So in a lot of cases, most every case, it's not just one thing. One rule doesn't work. It's a combination of elements. It's size, it's position, it's overlap. Those are all things that you kind of have to consider independently that will all add to the aggregate effect or the message, the story that you're trying to tell. I got another one here. This one kind of defies spatial depth. And this happens, if you do an image and you put something in the two bottom corners like this, it really flattens out your image, okay? It really flattens your spatial depth. And that's a difficult and an awkward scenario. So anything that you have just cropping in your corners will tend to flatten. And the reason that they flatten is because anything that sits in a corner, or if I have a square here, and I draw an object, something like this, maybe it's a tree, maybe it's something else. If I draw an object that's parallel to a side or has a stronger relationship to the side or the bottom of the frame, it associates with the frame. So my figure starts to echo the frame. And when it starts to echo the frame too much, it becomes flat. So these two, the figure it begins to echo or lock to the frame. So anytime you get these situations, what's happening is the object doesn't sit in that frame as much as it draws your attention to the edge. Okay? Degas would do things, I mean, he with the advent of camera, things were cropped. And he started cropping in interesting ways, his compositions. He started cropping in very interesting ways. And that was to imply that it's a bigger world than just inside that. So here you have a frame, but it's a bigger world. He's telling you, I'm doing this section of this bigger scenario. So it becomes a window to some imaginary place. Okay, instead of this is my whole place, it became the window to this illusionary space. Okay, and the interesting thing there too is you have a contrast. We're really all about contrast. And you can have a contrast between the surface and illusion. So what ends up happening is, this is a big factor in our compositions and actually how we apply our marks down too. We have marks that will imply the surface or sit on the surface, and we put those next to something that is really about the illusion, or we get lost in the illusion. We get a contradiction, okay? And it becomes a contrast, and it becomes something that we're drawn to contrast. One person that comes to mind is like Richard Schmid. If you're familiar with Richard Schmid's work, he'll have some areas of his composition that is full illusion. It has this beautiful handling of rendering or of a lighting or whatever, and he might have a bold brushstroke or a wash or a drip right next to that, okay? Well, what's actually happening, and the way we're affected by that, is we get illusion and we get the surface together at once, and we're trying to make sense of that contradiction. It's a visual tension. Well, we find that kind of tension or contrast attractive, okay? In many cases, there's a lot of people that find that attractive. That, before him, there was many other artists that did the same thing. And some people have said, well, this is their unfinished work or whatever. Well, they signed it. It's not unfinished. They signed it, And really what they're doing is they're using that surface to illusion contrast, okay, to actually enhance the level of the illusion. I'll say, with watercolors, it's one of those things that, if you're nervous about something, you get a little watermark or something, and you think you blew it, just make a bigger watermark next to it, or blast some paint in there next to it. And in relation, it'll become very subtle. Okay? So it's just all about that relationship that you're pushing and pulling. As far as breaking some of these things down, Maitland Graves, his book on the art of color and design, it was actually a textbook. It was like a college art textbook. And he had some interesting little examples, this being some of them, and we don't have to go through a whole lot of them. I just thought they were kind of interesting, kind of amusing. But what they are is they're just marks and division of space. And the question was, can you pick the most pleasing composition? And really what it comes down to is variation on the theme. And that's really what he was pointing out. The one in the top, the one on the left, well, the one on the right, how the two black marks and the two light marks, they end right on top of one another. It makes it rigid and kind of static, where the other one is a little bit more dynamic. The next one, where there's texture, the one on the right is almost bisected down the middle, or across. So the top is smooth, the bottom is rough. Where you have a little variation, where it's the proportion is a little favors one or the other, that is less static. It gives you a point of view. It just favors one thing over the other. And we tend to look at that and say, it's more interesting than something that's just broken right down the middle. The four black squares, when you see that they're positioned very symmetrically to one another, it tends to be rigid, where the other one seems to be a little bit more fluid. The other was a little too dark. It's hard to see. But with any of these, you can see where there's relationships that are like the one on the lower left here, with the circle and the bar and the triangle, or the square and the triangle. The one above, where it's a vertical rectangle, there's a little bit more interest to that one because, again, like we experienced with the circle and the squares just now, the one on the bottom left, the circle, the square, and the triangle kind of sit equidistant, and we start comparing them. So they become independent objects that we're comparing, where the composition right above, we're looking for the whole design. We see it more as a holistic design or a pattern, that there's a relationship between them, not compared one against the other. When we look at an image and we end up just comparing one thing to another, it doesn't really reveal a lot of emotional direction, or it doesn't give us a stronger emotional response. But in all cases, they're pretty much the same. It's just looking for something that is designed slightly different, or that has something more than just a comparison or a static resolve. The one at the top here, they're both divided in half. But if you take a look at the one on the left or the right, which one looks more dynamic? The one on the right, doesn't it? It looks more dynamic because the vertical line is more dynamic than a horizontal line. It has a tendency to move faster than a horizontal line.